My name's Pete Mowforth, and my sister Susan Mowforth, who's used to come up from England to help give this talk to you all this evening. I'm not sure if any of you will be old enough to remember the Second World War, this is really something that's almost happened by accident. It's really just a family thing. We thought it was only really of interest amongst the family, and if any of you saw the one show a week or so ago, it seems to have gone from what we thought was just a family thing to something very much bigger, and I think it's been a surprise to all of us. There's a book that's been produced, and this is really the story of some letters that took place. It's about the same size as War and Peace, all of the dates, but these are letters that took place between our father and our mother. They just got married at the start of the war, and then went off to live their own lives for 6 years, and then came back together again. And I just hope you find it of interest. So anyway.
Okay, good evening. Good evening. Mum and Dad had died, and the family house needed clearing out and selling. I'm sure a lot of you have actually been faced with a very similar situation. There was a lifetime's collection of furniture and crockery and pictures and jewellery and goodness knows what. It all needed sorting and getting rid of. There was big boxes of papers, documents, school reports, old mortgage deeds, solicitors' letters, bills, you name it. And right in the bottom of one, I found wrapped up carefully in brown paper and tied with a ribbon, a bundle of letters. So, dusty and dirty as I was, I just peered inside it, and I could recognise my mother's and my father's handwriting. It seemed to be letters that they'd written to each other during the 6 years of the Second World War. What should I do with it? Bundle it all back up again, take it home, put it in a drawer and try and forget about it. But it kept playing on my mind. What should I do with this big bundle of letters? So I asked the family, and they all said they'd really like to read them. But you can't read cramped handwriting. We're not used to reading handwriting these days. It would be so much easier if they were typed. So I'm no typist. But by coincidence, I was at a party, a neighbour's party, and I met a lady there who A, she could type, and B, she had some time to spare. So we came to an arrangement, and 3 years later, she emailed me the last bunch of the letters. There's 400,000 words of letters in those, so it took some typing. Then I asked the family, well, do you just want me to email you these letters, or should we produce them in a nice book so we can all have them to pass down through the family for generations? And we were quite amazed, really, when they all said they'd like a nice book making. So we had this book printed, just 20 copies, distributed among the family. One went to the Imperial War Museum, who were very, very glad to have it. One went to the Youth Hostel Association, the YHA, because our parents were very keen youth hostelers, and we've got a couple of spares. So today's presentation is just a very brief snapshot of, as you can imagine, some of the letters that you might find a bit more interesting than the others.
Our parents came from Sheffield. My father was born in 1913. He was a very keen cyclist. He cycled, all over the English Midlands and won various competitions and certificates. These bikes had no gears on. I don't know how they managed in those days. But as well as that, he was a keen rambler and member of the Youth Hostel Association. That's him there. Just love the trousers. And whereas today people show off their iPods and things, here they are busy showing off their high-tech cameras. And by way of work, he worked in the local government. He was actually in the Sheffield City Waterworks department.
Whereas Mum was born in 1918, so she was 5 years younger than Dad. She worked in the Sunshine Shop in Sheffield, which is a food health shop. And she was also a keen member of the Youth Hostel Association. It's actually through youth hosteling that they met and fell in love. World War II was declared in September 1939, and they got married in June of 1940. Dad was 26 and Mum was just 22 at the time. Then Dad was called up 3 months after they got married.
Now, I need to say a little bit about the actual letters themselves. The collection is made up of about 1,000 items that look like this. As Sue said, they were sort of handwritten letters. They didn't have Facebook, Twitter, all these things we have today. And they're a mixture of surface mail letters, airmail letters, postcards, occasional telegrams, and notes that were squirreled away and hidden inside parcels. Now, the service that took all of these items between Britain and where the fighting was taking place, it was all organised by the Royal Engineers. And I think we've both been really surprised by how little of the information actually got lost. It was very little. It seemed to be sort of probably more reliable than the post office today, I suspect. Dad used to post back little trinkets, because he spent the first half of the war in the Middle East and then the second half of the war fighting in Europe. And he'd send back little trinkets of food, so he'd send a few dates back and things like this, sort of things you couldn't get back home. And Mum would post out cigarettes, money, books, cycling magazines, YHA magazines, newspapers, and as well as cleaned and darned items of underwear and socks. And this was the sort of stuff that went backwards and forwards between home and the front. The post office took many weeks for these things to, the engineers took many weeks to get from one place to the other. And it meant that if Mum had gone for a couple of months without a letter, there'd be a lot of anguish, not knowing what had happened. A thing that you don't just get information and news then as we do today. And also, it was a bit disjointed. It's having a conversation with somebody where there's a gap of several weeks. And getting things from the front simply wasn't easy. And also, Dad had to be quite careful about what he said. There was mention in one of the early letters of Dad accidentally mentioning where he was stationed, and of course the censor would cut it out with a pair of scissors. So, and this caused Mum upset, because she not only didn't get to see where he was posted, but if you turned the letter the other side, there was a bit of the story missing on the other side of a bit of paper. Now, it's really only possible to touch on a few points in the story over the 6 years of the war. And Mum and Dad really lived in very, very different worlds during that period. As far as this evening is concerned, I'm going to read a few little extracts from what Dad had to say, and Sue will read a few bits and pieces about what Mum had to say. Dad was conscripted into the Royal Tank Regiment and was sent to train at Catterick. That's in Yorkshire. Mum got a job and accommodation nearby, and this was very fortuitous because at the very start of the war, when she went down to Catterick, Sheffield was very badly bombed, and so she really was quite lucky in avoiding the worst of it.
So we'll start off with the first extract. I was hosteling for the weekend. I felt that I had to do normal things as far as possible in order to keep myself properly balanced. For heaven only knows how I've pulled through this last week. To think that only a fortnight ago we were together at Catterick with no such thoughts as these. Well, back in Sheffield, Mum found a job working shifts in air raid precautions, and she wrote explaining about her new job. I'm the city engineer's representative on an air raid precaution control, and I'm sat at my desk now writing to you, darling. Until anything happens, I've very little to do. I look like a real trooper these days. The city engineers have issued me with a tin hat and service respirator. Just imagine your poor little Olga under all that weight. Mum was only 4'11 3/4, a bit like Betsy here. In October 1941, she wrote, "I was on duty last night and saw my first bit of action. No bombs were dropped, but planes were passing over, and one shell from our anti-tank aircraft guns didn't explode in the air, but came down in Southbourne Road and burst on impact, killing 2 men. I would much rather be at work during raids, for apart from all the company, there's also the knowledge that if anything happens, I'm in a position to help, and that gives me a measure of satisfaction." Now, in addition to working 60 hours a week, she spent time with Dad's parents. There's our grandparents in their greenhouse. Filled in for Dad's voluntary work on various youth hostel and other committees, moved house, shopped, cooked, and did all the other 101 other jobs that were made more difficult by wartime conditions. She seemed to write all or part of a letter almost every day.
Dad had left Britain, and they were carried round the south coast of Africa, up through the east coast of Africa, through Suez, and into Egypt. That was where our father's war started. His first desert campaign was at the Battle of Tobruk in North Africa during the winter of 41 and 42. The British forces were taking real pummeling from the Germans during this period, and Dad was really in the thick, as far as we can tell, of all the various battles. These culminated in the first and second battles of El Alamein, which, from the British perspective, were really the turning point for the war. Here's a short extract from a letter of his on the 5th of January 1942, near the end of the campaign. "There's so little I can write and tell you. There's nothing I can say except that I'm safe and well, reasonably comfortable and longing more than ever to get back home.
Hello, my sweetheart. I've just finished a 13-page letter, but I suppose it will be weeks before you get it. I keep looking for news, sweetheart, but I've got my fingers crossed, for I'm sure you're okay. I always know that, just as I can always feel when you're in trouble."
And then again written on the 15th of January, but not received until May 1942. "We picked up our tanks on the 20th of November and started the last run up to the Libyan border. Then the fun commenced. A Nazi armoured column had broken through and was running around the back area through which we were moving, creating merry hell amongst our supply vehicles. We hunted that blasted column for a week. He'd be 6 miles one side, then 8 miles the other, and so on. And of course, he could move much faster than our heavy tanks. We were up and on the move every day before dawn, in the tank at action stations all day, with just a snatch meal of biscuits and bully, make camp at dusk, do maintenance until 11 or 12 o'clock, adjusting, oiling, refueling, etc. All mucky jobs. A rub of cotton waste over the hands, off with the overalls, into the blankets until 5 a.m, then off again. Gosh, darling, you should have seen us after a week of that. Unwashed, unshaved, half-fed."
"I'm sorry you're not receiving my letters, so I'm sending this in the hope that it will reach you sooner." This must have been an aerograph that she'd sent. "And incidentally, your airmail cards of late have taken 7 weeks. This may be due to extra Christmas mail. Aerographs are only taking about 15 days. Bit of a difference between today's emails and then. I seem to have so much to do these days. Next Wednesday is our ARP, that's Air Raid Precautions dance, at Owlerton Memorial Hall, and I've helped with most of the arrangements for this, as none of the other girls seem to have done anything like it before. They want piles of refreshments, and heavens, what a job that is nowadays. It's taken most of my spare time for over a week to manage it, but it's been worth it. We hope to cater for over 200, and there'll be bridge rolls, ham sandwiches, tomato sandwiches, new scones, wafer biscuits, cakes, minerals, and plenty of coffee.
We found a place to park our tanks, climbed out, just going to start a fire to make a meal, and wee bang. One shell dropped about 20 yards one side of the tank, another about the same the other side. I don't quite know how it happened, but I was inside that tank with the lid down before the next shell finished whistling.
I don't think I mentioned it before, but transport fares have now been increased. Ecclesall to Door is twopence halfpenny. I mean, it doesn't sound much, but it's just one of those things that make banking accounts a dream these days. These little extras seem to come from everywhere.
We got the remaining big guns before any of our tanks were hit. The Italians in the outer trenches soon surrendered. The Nazis in the inner ring kept us busy all day. We kept coming out, checking over the track, refueling, refilling with ammo, and in again. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we came out for the last time because our tracks were badly damaged, and lucky for us, we just crawled back alongside our tent when one track broke. 20 minutes earlier, and would have been parked right in the enemy lines. When we first went in, all I could think of was you, Mother and Father, and the effects of a Jerry 6-inch shell. When battles began, I'd no time to think of anything at all. It was load, reload and reload again. I was scared stiff at the thought of going in, yet somehow, once in, one seemed to forget about personal danger. One just concentrated on the game in hand.
Friday, I had to go to town in the morning to do all my shopping, pay the electric and gas, etc. Really, there's nothing to buy. All the fruit shops looked lovely, full of flowers. I'm looking for a good recipe for flower pie.
The column of prisoners came past our lines, poor devils. They looked just about as fed up as we ourselves felt. However, for them, their war was over. We went round their trenches next day. They appeared to have ample of everything: water, food, ammo, guns, etc. They have much drinking water, a special brand of spa water in 2-pint bottles. Lovely stuff. I drank a whole bottle in about 10 minutes. The best water I've tasted since I left home.
I'm going to sell the old washer and get a nice tabletop wringer with a tub. According to newspaper adverts, I should invest the money in savings certificates, but the trouble is you can't squeeze clothes with certificates, now can you?
Next morning, we finished a leisurely brekker at about 9 o'clock. An infantry officer stopped to have a chat with us. What, no food, he said. About half a mile over there is a Jerry food dump. As soon as he had gone, we made a beeline for the dump. What a place. Rows and rows and rows of cases. Meat, vegetables, cheese, fruit, enough tinned food to feed thousands. We loaded up the tank and set off again for Tobruk.
I'm not so bad off as some though, for I've got a garden and I'm almost self-supporting for greens and salads. And there are some spring onions coming too. They're pretty valuable at 6pence for a bunch of 5 onions. Page 7 of this letter, and I haven't said one word about us yet, darling, have I? Well, to start with me, I've been spending again. This time, material for a summer coat. You know I haven't got one, and I couldn't afford 18 coupons, or yet the price they're asking for ready-mades. So I've got material for 11 coupons, and your mum has given me the lining out of an old coat of hers, so I can have a new coat. The material cost me 32 3/4, and it's a very nice fawn wool and Angora, though a light summer weight. I only have to pay for making, as I'm only having it plain. The dressmaker can do it, and she's very reasonable, so it'll be a cheap coat.
An airmail letter of the 10th of November 1942. We were all sat alongside the tank, chatting and swatting flies, when whee bang! We'd just time to duck, and were all under the tank, me swearing and cursing like hell and holding my arm. A piece of shrapnel about the size of an OXO cube had caught me right on the funny bone. I couldn't use my arm for a couple of hours afterwards. Luckily, it was nearly spent and didn't penetrate. I hope to be back with the unit shortly, and then, whoopee, all my backmail for the last few weeks. I'll have writer's cramp, you hope.
The news from Libya is very disturbing. I do hope, darling, you're not in the thick of it this time. Do take care of yourself. Now, both of us had assumed that the whole British population would have been fired up and working their socks off to support the war effort, so we were quite surprised to read in the letters about the following 2 issues. The first is about how many strikes there were. Easter, 1943. Hello, sweetheart. Yes, Easter Sunday, and I'm working Saturday, Sunday and Monday. Well, that's nothing, but the ruddy transport department needs to go on strike. There's not a tram, not a bus. I went off duty at 8 o'clock this morning and it took me an hour and a half to get home. I know what I'd do with the ringleaders of this strike. It would be the army for them with no hesitation. It's nothing short of sabotage.
What is happening? We keep getting news of strikes, here, there and everywhere. The general opinion of the lads out here is shoot the bees.
Strikes are becoming increasingly common these days. My opinion of them is very low. It's nothing short of murder.
If those men knew what it means to see your pals killed and wounded because they had to go into battle armed with inadequate guns and equipment, we know the difference between attacking 88s with 2-pounders and with 75s. It's all the difference between life and death.
And the second issue that we were surprised to read about was that of conscientious objectors. Before he went away, Dad had offered to help two of his oldest friends, Eric, who was a conscientious objector, and his wife, Renee. They moved in with Mum while Dad was away. This caused a bit of friction, and eventually Mum asked them to leave. This rather upset Dad, but it's interesting to see how Mum and Dad battered the argument to and fro before they understood each other's position.
Probably I'm partly to blame for the trouble because I gave them to understand that we'd do anything to help them if they needed assistance.
Well, you may be great friends, you may have hosteled with them, camped with them, but you haven't lived with them. If they'd lost their home through reasons beyond their control, I could understand it. But Eric's just blind stupid. He prattles on about this being a capitalist war. What about the USSR? Does he think they're fighting for capitalism? Can't he see that this is a life and death struggle for freedom?
What's this phrase in your letter? I'm not likely to change my opinions during or after the war. Just read that bit again, Dux. Since when have we admitted that anything, even our opinions, are fixed and unchanging?
Well, Rennie left here on Monday, and in spite of the fact that you're displeased with me, I'm not sorry they've gone. I propose we leave the whole matter until you come home. Rennie and I parted friends, and I talked with Eric last night at the YHA opening night.
This is where I make an apology. I should have placed far greater trust in your insight and knowledge. It's impossible to stomach passive resistance to a mad dog when you know what will happen if he overpowers you. I also would have changed from the views I held in 1942 and realise now I couldn't live long with a person of such different views. We'll leave it there, and I've hardly left enough room to tell you I still love you and more than ever. The North Africa campaign had finished, and throughout many of his letters he had complained consistently about the kind of tanks that they had. They were the Matilda tanks. They were very slow, they had very light armour and a little pop gun where the gun was supposed to be. And his war really changed because he was able to come back to Britain before the Normandy invasion and pick up a new tank. And then this was the Comet tank that he took over, which was very fast, very heavily armoured, and it had a big gun. And for the first time, he felt he had a machine that was capable of fighting the German tanks. And interestingly, there were only two places in the UK that had cranes big enough to lift a Comet. One was in London, and the other one was here in Glasgow, where he came to pick up his new tank. Now, I think move the next slide. So he will have come down from Glasgow and then crossed over to Normandy just after the beaches had been liberated. They were involved in a lot of fighting down here just south of the beaches, and from there up until the end of the war that ended in Lubeck, they fought their way up through France, through Belgium, through the Netherlands, and up through Germany, and very close to the end of the war, his was the very first group of people who went into a place called Belsen, which is just briefly mentioned in one sentence in one letter. But I think it was perfectly clear that the tone of his letters, after seeing the quite horrendous activities that had taken place in that death camp, he just wanted to get that war finished, and they moved very quickly up to the surrender of Germany.
By 1943, a lot of Mum's and Dad's friends had been killed in action. One of Mum's voluntary jobs was to post youth hostel magazines to the troops. She wrote, "I was getting the addresses ready yesterday for sending rucksacks to the forces, and I went through the file and took out 9 names that were prisoners or killed, and there must be many more I don't know of yet. These poor lads whom once we knew and laughed with are now dead because there's a war. You may know some of them. Pat Scott, H. Morrell, Craig Middlemas, G.G. Lee, Frederick Johnson, R.T. Dolling, A. Cutler, Ted Camsell, Roy Otter." In 1943, Mum wrote, "It's been raining cats and dogs today. There were 5 of us going in on duty, and we could hear a plane that didn't sound too jolly in the engine. But though he seemed right overhead and low, we couldn't see it for low cloud. 50 seconds later, he crashed in Riverdale Road on Endcliffe Woodside. A flying fortress, full crew killed. It's a funny thing, you can hear on the news of 1,000 men killed on this front or that, and it doesn't really sound real. But when you see 9 men come down right before your eyes, and you know they were returning from a job of work and were just ready for tea, it shakes you. Makes me realise what it must be like to see men you know killed before your eyes."
This is
apparently,
This is the stone there.
there's a memorial to the crash, still there in Endcliffe Park today in Sheffield.
In November 1944, Dad wrote, "We got into northeastern France, across the Seine, and the character of the country changes. Welcome smiles, folks coming to the doors as the convoy passes, waving and shouting bon voyage and good luck. We stop for a short halt. A woman comes running out of her house with a basket of apples. They are all given out and she runs back for more. This afternoon, I had an unexpected pleasure. I fired my first shot into Germany. Don't know what I hit, but one can't go wrong. Now we're playing them on their home ground. I told you in my last letter I was due to give a lecture."
That's me.
Oh, sorry.
I told you in my last letter that I was due to give a lecture this afternoon in my first aid course. My subject was shock, followed by a verbal and practical on dressings and bandages. I don't mind telling you I was shaking with fright when I got up onto the platform. But after the first few minutes, I found myself speaking with perfect confidence.
1st of April 1945. Good morning, precious. As you say, the news is good and getting better, but don't be too optimistic about a sudden ending. There may be white flags on all the houses when we've passed a place, but until then it's a case of look out or else. We'd cut the main road south of Lubeck when our RAF spotters reported the Nazis fleeing down the roads towards the river. We were ordered to cut off the town at all speeds. We swung east by tracks through the woods and then tore down that road 4 tanks abreast, flat out. It was crazy tactics, but it paid. Before they knew what had happened, we were taking the Germans prisoner as they retreated out of the town. We were on our way to Denmark when the standstill order was given a few days ago.
At 3 p.m, they announced Germany's unconditional surrender. After all these years, it seems hard to believe. I wish I knew just what you were doing, darling. Wish I could talk to you for just 5 minutes.
Today, life goes on as usual, except there's no more push-on business, no more leading tank, no more sudden death. I don't think there's a chance now about doing any more fighting, so all that remains is having to put up with army life until I get discharged. I still can't get used to the feeling of no longer living on the edge of eternity.
Well, ducks, today is a happy day and we shall celebrate and then we shall start work again. We shall work to finish the Far Eastern War, work to win the peace, and then perhaps this ghastly thing called war will not shadow our lives again. Cheerio, sweetheart, good luck, and remember that you're in all our hearts today. All my love and kisses, on paper at present, Olga.
Now, it might be sort of quite difficult to believe, but Dad was actually quite a romantic. He wrote some very moving poetry, especially during 1941. And what I'd like to do is just read a short 4-verse poem that he wrote when he was in North Africa. And I think in many ways it sort of summarises what the life of these two people were as they were sort of separated throughout this 6-year period. The title of the poem is You and I. You and I, and me and you, how we are and what we do, of whom we think, to whom we talk, of what we dream, with whom we walk. Where we went last week, last night, of things that came within our sight, what we hope to do tomorrow, greetings, yearnings, joy and sorrow. Relations, news and neighbours' chatters, gardening notes, financial matters, these the content of our days, tell of parting broken ways. Writing, words and phrases, when what we crave are love's embraces. But only when all fascists cease, shall we together live in peace. I'm sure none of you remember this and anything in this period of history, but I think things like this very often trigger ideas in people's own minds about their own families and what happened to them. Have you any questions?
Ladies? No questions at all?
Mother's name Olga.
Yes.
Where did that come from?
Well, there was an Olga back up the family tree, but I have no idea really where that came from. But I presume that was a connection to grandma's connection.
So when did you come along? Family come along? When did you go home?
Oh, well,
No, the thing is that there are actually our parents had 3 children. Sue, myself, and I should say my brother, who's back, who's over here from Sweden, and in fact, he's the only one who's mentioned in the book.
yeah.
Because Dad, yes, exactly. Dad came home with.
You must
I
have
think
leave, obviously get leave, didn't
No, he came home.
he came home at the end of the war.
Yeah.
But then during the war, did you not go home at all?
No.
After 3 years, he got about a month back home, and that's when he picked up the tank and went back to Normandy. And then he was across Europe until the end of the war. At the end of the war, he came back on leave, hence John, and then he got sent back to Europe again because keeping the peace was almost more difficult than fighting the war. So he went back there to keep the peace for a year before he was finally demobbed.
And then he became a teacher. I think it's interesting because so many people who came back wanted to give back, through all the horrors that they had witnessed and lived through. And he was a teacher, and it's really strange because you don't really sort of think of. I think this is something that Sue's often said. You just don't think of your parents as people. As people who had been lovers and had lived through these remarkable things. You just think of them as people who provide the mortgage and taxi services and so on.
Did they ever talk to you about anything to do with their past? Never.
No, this was. I know it is absolutely a cliche. People say people from that generation just didn't talk about it, but nobody did. There were 1 or 2 little things they said, but. I mean, he once told me he'd lost 3 tanks. The attrition rate was absolutely dreadful during that period. But really, no, they didn't. He certainly never mentioned anything about Belsen. And if you were the first people through the door, I mean.
But our mother died when she was quite young. She was only 54.
I was going to ask you how
And I don't remember her as a person, if you like. I remember her as my mother, which is quite a different sort of impression that you get of a personality, isn't it, when you're just thinking of them as a mother. And it's only really through these letters I've come to understand what she was like as a person.
And I think that's true for all the family. I think it's really brought a lot of people in the family together. realising what these incredible, that unbelievable generation of people were.
How long did it take you to read all these and to decipher them the way you've done so well?
It's 5 years, wasn't it?
Well, it was
must have been a long
5
time.
years to put the book together. It took about a week to get the presentation together, because
That's
this
superb.
is the second presentation that we've done. We did the first one to the Glasgow Historical Society, didn't we?
Yeah, and then the BBC phoned us up.
I missed it. Betsy told us.
Oh, you can go to iPlayer.
What's that?
You can go to iPlayer. They wanted it for Valentine's Day because they thought it was how nice it was when people actually wrote to each other.
Radio Sheffield.
Yeah.
Would they make it into a film? Could it be made into a film?
I suppose it could, but
Yeah.
The thing is, can I tell you, until a few weeks ago, we genuinely, really, only thought that it would be of interest to the family, and I think and it's Marie from the Historical Society, Marie Davidson, who sort of said when she saw the book and said, "Oh my goodness, you really ought to give a talk about this." And we offered a copy to the Imperial War Museum, thinking that, oh, I suppose something else to stick on the shelf. And they came back and said they just don't get this kind of historical record, because normally history is written by kings and queens and generals and historians, but to actually be written by the people who were there in the smoke and sweat and difficulties of the day-to-day existence was a very unusual thing, and it's much more believable. I'd rather believe what was said there in these dated letters than what a historian or somebody might say who's trying to impose spin or interpretation on it.
But they must have got the letters all together, because some of them from both sides, and they knew that they had the letters there themselves.
Oh, well, we've got all the letters at home.
Yes.
They want the letters. The Imperial War Museum would like the collection of letters in the fullness of time.
But your parents have kept those letters.
Yeah.
Do you know,
It's
I
unusual for
don't
them.
think they have been opened since they'd been parcelled up. Maybe the first time they moved, after they got back together at the end of the war. They didn't look as if the parcels
He must
had
have
been
got his back from
His
the
must
war.
have come back.
Yeah, exactly.
So he kept his
Yeah.
all the way he was around the war.
Well, I don't know how that bit worked, whether or not every soldier had got a locker somewhere or other, and so
But
things
it's
were...
nice they both kept them.
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
Brought together.
But the thing is, I bet you there'll be people in this room who have had, within their own families and their own relations, they'll have had these piles of letters, and what do you do with them? I mean, most people just go, oh, it's just too much hard work, or you think, oh, it's too personal, so you leave them in the back of the cupboard, and then you leave them in the back, and then eventually it goes in the bin, or it goes on the fire, and these things are lost, and it's really Sue, absolutely Sue, who put in the hard work to make sure that didn't happen with our family. And although it took me a year to read it, I just think it just gives a fantastic insight into the family.
Grandchildren must be absolutely thrilled. It must be a great heritage to them.
Yeah.
What a heritage to have. It's just
And it's a
something.
tribute to our parents as well.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
And I mean, and also people during war, they talk about heroes or things like that. Can I tell you, nobody in our family thinks of either our parents as heroes in any way. They're just people who did they're just ordinary people who just did what they did. And I think that would have applied to the vast majority of people who didn't want to be a hero, they just did what they had to do.
I don't think people actually spoke too much about it once they came home.
They didn't. Not to the kids, certainly.
I still have my mother who'll be 97 next week, and trying to get her to talk about the war, and she'll say, oh, that's all best forgotten.
Yeah.
Forget it all. Yeah, and she's told us things over the years, but I'm sure she's got loads of things she could tell us. If she now and again she'll come out with things that she did during the war. I think, my goodness, Mum, that was dangerous. Oh, I didn't think about that. know, she walks through parks at 2 o'clock in the morning to pick up a tram car in Partick through Kelvin Grove Park. She said you
Yeah.
didn't give a thought to the fact